Can you say something about some of the details of the software engineering challenges required to build these browsers? I mean, the engineering challenges of creating a product that hasn't really existed before, that can have such almost like limitless impact on the world with the internet.
So there was a really key bet that we made at the time, which is very controversial, which was core to how it was engineered, which was, are we optimizing for performance or for ease of creation?
Yeah.
And in those days, the pressure was very intense to optimize for performance because the network connections were so slow, and also the computers were so slow. And so if you had, I mentioned the progressive JPEGs, like if there's an alternate world in which we optimize for performance, and you had just a much more pleasant experience right up front. But what we got by not doing that was we got ease of creation. And the way that we got ease of creation was all of the protocols and formats were in text, not in binary. And so HTTP is in text. By the way, and this was an internet tradition, by the way, that we picked up, but we continued it. HTTP is text, and HTML is text, and then everything else that followed is text. As a result, and by the way, you can imagine purist engineers saying, this is insane. You have very limited bandwidth. Why are you wasting any time sending text? You should be encoding this stuff into binary, and it'll be much faster. And of course, the answer is that's correct. But what you get when you make it text is all of a sudden, well, the big breakthrough was the view source function, right? So the fact that you could look at a web page, you could hit view source, and you could see the HTML. That was how people learned how to make web pages, right?
It's so interesting because the stuff we take for granted now is man, that was fundamental to the development of the web, to be able to have HTML just right there. All the ghetto mess that is HTML, all the sort of almost biological like messiness of HTML, and then having the browser try to interpret that mess.
Yeah, exactly.
To show something reasonable.
Well, and then there was this internet principle that we inherited, which was emit cautiously, emit conservatively, interpret liberally. So it basically meant the design principle was if you're creating like a web editor that's going to emit HTML, like do it as cleanly as you can. But you actually want the browser to interpret liberally, which is you actually want users to be able to make all kinds of mistakes and for it to still work.
Yeah.
And so the browser rendering engines to this day have all of this spaghetti code, crazy stuff where they're resilient to all kinds of crazy HTML mistakes. And literally what I always had in my head is like there's an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old somewhere, and they're doing a view source, they're doing a cut and paste, and they're trying to make a web page for their turtle or whatever. And like they leave out a slash and they leave out an angle bracket and they do this and they do that, and it still works.
It's also like I don't often think about this, but programming, C++, C++, all those languages, Lisp, the compiled languages, the interpreted languages, Python, Perl, all of that, the brace have to be all correct.
Yes.
It's like everything has to be perfect.
Brutal.
And then
autistic.
You forget. All right. It's systematic and rigorous. Yeah. Let's go there. But you forget that the web with JavaScript eventually, and HTML is allowed to be messy in the way, for the first time, messy in the way biological systems could be messy. Yeah. It's like the only thing computers were allowed to be messy on for the first time.
It used to offend me. So I grew up on Unix. So I worked on Unix. I was a Unix native for all the way through this period. And it used to drive me bananas when it would do the segmentation fault in the core dump file. Just like it's like literally there's like an error in the code. The math is off by 1, and it core dumps.
Yeah.
And I'm in the core dump trying to analyze it and trying to reconstruct and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. Like the computer ought to be smart enough to be able to know that if it's off by 1, okay, fine, and it keeps running. And I would go ask all the experts, like, why can't it just keep running? And they'd explain to me, well, because all the downstream repercussions and blah, blah. And I'm like, this still like, we're forcing the human creator to live, to your point, in this hyper literal world of perfection.
Yeah.
And I was just like, that's just bad. And by the way, what happens with that, of course, is what happened with coding at that point, which is you get a high priesthood. There's a small number of people who are really good at doing exactly that. Most people can't, and most people are excluded from it. And so actually that was where I picked up that idea was like, no, you want these things to be resilient to error in all kinds. And this would drive the purists absolutely crazy. Like I got attacked on this like a lot because like every time all the purists who were like into all this like markup language stuff and formats and codes and all this stuff, they would be like, you can't, you're encouraging bad behavior because
Oh, so they wanted the browser to give you a segfault error anytime there was a
Yeah, they wanted it to be a comment, right? They wanted
Yeah.
that was a very, and any properly trained and credentialed engineer would be like, that's not how you build these systems.
That's such a bold move to say, no, it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Now, like I said, the good news for me is the internet kind of had that tradition already. But having said that, like we pushed it. We pushed it way out. But the other thing we did, going back to the performance thing, was we gave up a lot of performance. We made that initial experience for the first few years was pretty painful. But the bet there was actually an economic bet, which was basically the demand for the web would basically mean that there would be a surge in supply of broadband. Like because the question was, okay, how do you get the phone companies, which are not famous in those days for doing new things at huge cost for like speculative reasons, like how do you get them to build out broadband? Spend billions of dollars doing that, and you could go meet with them and try to talk them into it, or you could just have a thing where it's just very clear that it's going to be that people love that's going to be better if it's faster. And so that there was a period there, and this was fraught with some peril, but there was a period there where it's like we knew the experience was sub-optimized because we were trying to force the emergence of demand for broadband.
Sure.
Which is in fact what happened.
So you had to figure out how to display this text, HTML text. So the blue links and the purple links, and there's no standards. Is there standards at that time?
No,
so
there really still isn't.
There's like there's implied standards, right? And there's all these kinds of new features that are being added with like CSS, with like what kind of stuff a browser should be able to support, features within languages, within JavaScript, and so on. But you're setting standards on the fly yourself.
Yeah. Well, to this day, if you create a web page that has no CSS style sheet, the browser will render it however it wants to.
Yeah.
Right. So this was one of the things. There was this idea at the time in how these systems were built, which is separation of content from format, or separation of content from appearance. And that's still people don't really use that anymore because everybody wants to determine how things look, and so they use CSS. But it's still in there that you can just let the browser do all the work.
I still like really basic websites, but that could be just old school. Kids these days with their fancy responsive websites that don't actually have much content but have a lot of visual elements.
Well, that's one of the things that's fun about ChatGPT. It's like
back to the basics,
back to just text.
Yeah.
Right. And there is this pattern in human creativity and media where you end up back at text, and I think there's something powerful in there.